Hey everyone, this is Brown at I of Brown, and it's been a bit since I've sat down and done a full-on review with you guys, but I wanted to take us on a little journey here back into the world of Sleepwalker with issue number 12, Dark Dreams and Darker Schemes. And you have here a comic that came out in May of 1992 with guest art by Joe Quesada, a very young Joe Quesada at this point in time, who also did the cover art here with inks by Michael Bair. And honestly, I gotta say, I love this cover art. Very detailed, very terrifying yet awesome at the same time. What with the Sleepwalker being ensnared by the demonic minions of Nightmare, right here, seeing in the shadow. And then you got Rick Sheridan on the ground there, sort of imperiled within the world of dreams, and Sleepwalker is having a hard time getting to him in time. But this is kind of continues a trend in the series in the sense that the cover art oftentimes reflected in some way what was going on within the comic. And sure enough, I mean, something like this does happen within this issue of Sleepwalker. But this issue was written and colored by series creator Bob Budiansky, and the pencils were once more done by a then young Joe Quesada, who was filling in as a guest artist, and the inks were by Michael Bair, who also did the inks for his cover, and Jimmy Palmiotti, who is definitely one of the best inkers within the comic book industry, and whether it's a fill-in job or a regular gig. But as far as one-shot guest art bits go, Sleepwalker number 12 was a really cool issue. And on one hand, it's good as a standalone issue in the series, or a standalone story in the series, but it also in some ways signifies the further descent into darkness that the Sleepwalker series seems to be taking at this point, because starting with, say, around, I would argue, issue 9, the series, it was still fun and entertaining, but there was a dark tone that seemed to kind of make its way into the series here. And issue number 12 here definitely continues that trend. What with Rick Sheridan being besieged in his dreams by the demonic force that is Nightmare within the Marvel Universe. And Nightmare was a foe who is regarded as a classic foe of one Doctor Strange, who basically haunts people's dreams and has his own schemes. See what I did there? But he has a purpose, as it were, in the sense that, dreams are the mind's way of emptying out its garbage, and that includes, good dreams and bad dreams. And bad dreams are Nightmare's domain, and oftentimes he's made a play for, full-on dominion within, I guess you could say, the mindscape, as it were. But this is actually the first time that Sleepwalker and Nightmare are in contact with each other, although it's not the first time that Sleepwalker has heard of him, because apparently, as it's told in this issue, the Sleepwalkers, the race that Sleepwalker is a part of, and Nightmare were aware of each other, but they sort of had this almost like a truce between each other, in a sense that because the Sleepwalkers never slept, Nightmare had no reason to go after them. And as long as Nightmare, stuck to his usual routine of controlling people's nightmares, albeit in a lawfully evil way, then Sleepwalkers would steer clear. And plus, on the occasions that Nightmare did step outside of his bounds, people like Doctor Strange tended to, step in and save the day. And so the Sleepwalkers were free to continue, their duties as police officers of the night's mindscape, as it were, keeping people's dreams from literally killing them, or at least the demonic entities within the mindscape from breaking through into people's dreams and killing them from there. But The issue, it's also a very effective standalone horror story because it blurs the lines between dreams and reality rather well, in the sense that Rick keeps having these nightmares in this issue about Sleepwalker going berserk and killing people. And to be fair, both Rick and Sleepwalker have been going through quite a bit of stress as of late to their mutual situation. Sleepwalker being stuck in Rick's mind and only being able to come out when Rick sleeps, and Rick having to adjust his life to the fact that he has an alien entity trapped in his head. And so the two had recently formed something of a coexistence to a point where they were somewhat friends, but at the same time, there were instances where they stressed each other out, or their own mutual life circumstances inconvenienced the other. And so it's a very interesting, odd couple type of story. But this was a point where the stress was kind of building to a peak in both characters' cases. With Rick, he's getting to a point where he's got a job as a apartment superintendent, and he's trying to do his job, painting the walls, doing plumbing and stuff like that. But because of his interrupted sleep schedule and further stress in his life, he's getting to a point where he's almost having waking dreams. And case in point, there's a very memorable visual moment where Rick's painting the walls in an apartment that the landlord's wanting to lease to someone soon, and Rick's supposed to be painting. But as he's doing it, he's starting to nod off and talk to himself, and you suddenly see Sleepwalker's form descend from the ceiling, which by the way is still covered in wet paint, descend from the ceiling in the form of this wet paint, but it's like in the shape of him. And it freaks Rick out enough to where he falls off the ladder and paint goes everywhere, and he snaps out of it and he realizes he was kind of having a waking dream. And so stuff like that's starting to happen with him on a regular basis. And then the nightmares that he's having, which his dreams are specifically nightmares, at least within the time frame of this issue, in which Sleepwalker keeps on killing those around him with his warping abilities that he uses with the beams that come out of his eyes. His race is forbidden from using their warping powers on living beings, but basically, basically they're able to warp the physical surroundings that they're a part of into, say, their advantage. Like, for example, they can use their warping abilities on, say, like a mailbox and make it sort of come to life and swallow someone, albeit in a way that keeps them contained until, say, the proper authorities can get to them, that kind of thing. And that's just the Sleepwalker as the main character. That's one of the instances with him. But if he were to use his warping abilities on a living being, he would do near irreparable damage on them, and they turn into some sort of twisted, deformed monstrosity. And so one of the things that's happening in these nightmares is that Rick is witnessing Sleepwalker blasting people with his beams, and they're turning into something like John Carpenter's The Thing. Case in point, when Rick's dog Rambo shows up in the dream, the dog starts barking at Sleepwalker, because it senses that something's wrong, and Sleepwalker, scolds it and just blasts it. And next thing you know, Rick's coming to within the dream, and the poor dog literally looks like something from John Carpenter's The Thing. If you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. So pretty horrifying stuff to, have in your head when you're trying to have a peaceful sleep. And so he's waking up screaming every time, and because stuff like this keeps happening. And then you have moments where, people are cut in half, or swallowed up by sewer grating within the same dreams. And so it's just adding up and adding up, and until eventually it gets to a point where Sleepwalker, he knows that something's wrong. I mean, because he knows that humans have nightmares. I mean, it's just part of the chemical process. But at the same time, I mean, he knows that the nightmares that Rick's having are unusual, and that they're more than, say, stress-induced. And he picks up on the fact that someone or something is actually trying to get to Rick or attack Rick specifically. And so on one particular night, instead of going out and patrolling the streets or looking for crime as he usually does when Rick's asleep, he goes out of his way to go back into Rick's head while Rick is asleep to try and find the guilty parties. And sure enough, he finds out that his hunch was correct. Someone or something was trying to attack Rick specifically, with an extra dose of horror, to a point of either killing Rick or driving him insane. And sure enough, this entity turns out to be Nightmare. And I'll be showing you all a picture of him in his full glory in a little bit here. But so Nightmare and Sleepwalker, after a little bit of social pleasantries are exchanged, and I use that term sarcastically, the two of them mix it up, and initially Nightmare seems to have Sleepwalker thoroughly outclassed, but then Sleepwalker is able to sort of turn the tables, because even though he's operating in Nightmare's realm at this point, he's a denizen of the mindscape, which in some way is tied to the realm of Nightmare. And so even though he's on Nightmare's domain, he's also within a domain that he is familiar with to some extent, even though the Sleepwalkers, as a rule, have stayed away from the realm of Nightmare unless the situation dictated it necessary. And so it's an interesting case, because you have Nightmare warping the surroundings of his landscape into attacking Sleepwalker, which is something Sleepwalker would do in the real world to attack evildoers. And so you have, like at one point you have, like it's portrayed on the cover, you have, say, objects turning into full-on snake-like creatures that leech Sleepwalker of his mental energy and things like that. But at the same time, he's using his warping abilities to, in turn, use the surface that those creatures are on and imprison them into sort of like a makeshift cage. So it kind of goes back and forth between the two, and then eventually the two of them get to a point where it's like they both realize they've underestimated each other in terms of how powerful both of them are. And so that's another thing I like about this issue, is that, I mean, you kind of knew how powerful Sleepwalker could be, but here, though, because he's actually going against an entity of the mindscape, or who is in some way tied to the mindscape, even though the realm of Nightmare and the mindscape are two somewhat different locations, they are related. The fact that Sleepwalker is able to cut loose here, you kind of get a preview of just how powerful he really is when he's not holding back like he is, say, in the real world, which he does because of his race's rules on not using their abilities on living beings. But anyway, though, Nightmare, though, he's able to play up the fact that because this is his realm, he holds all the cards, and he's holding the life and sanity of Rick Sheridan in his hands. And so, but the thing is, this whole thing has been orchestrated by Nightmare to actually get to Sleepwalker, not Rick, Sleepwalker, because it turns out that the Nightmare, I mean, he's of course well aware of this sort of unofficial truce that seems to exist between the race of the Sleepwalkers and himself. And unfortunately, the fact that Sleepwalker has been a part of Rick's mind for the time he's done so, it's basically played havoc with Nightmare's plans in terms of giving Rick nightmares or feeding off of his mental energies like he would normally do. And granted, he does that to everyone, every single living being in the Marvel Universe, it would seem. But the fact that there's a full-on Sleepwalker literally inside Rick's head guarding him from, I guess you could say, the extra potent energies that Nightmare would have, basically means that that Rick Sheridan's sleeping patterns have been altered to a point where, while he has had nightmares from time to time, Sleepwalker's presence has nullified them to a point where, Nightmare can't benefit from them. And so, this whole time he's been within this issue, he's been trying to get a point to get Sleepwalker's attention. And what better way than to attack his human host's mental psyche while he's trying to sleep? And so, since Rick was at a point where, as I said earlier, he's very stressed out, psychologically, it makes him easy pickings for Nightmare to play havoc with, and that in turn drew Sleepwalker's attention. And so, next thing you know, the two of them are kind of at a stalemate. Basically, okay, we both underestimated each other. Let's take a breather. Here's my offer. And so Nightmare basically is able to appeal to Sleepwalker's desire to return to his realm of the mindscape, which, I mean, if you've listened to my review of the first 11 issues, or if you've read the series yourself, you'll know that Sleepwalker has basically been stuck within, either Rick's mind or the real world, but he's been prevented from going back into the mindscape because of something that happened way back in issue 1. But basically, Nightmare is literally offering him a way to go back, and granted, it would be a one-way trip. Once he goes through that tunnel into his realm, then he's forbidden to interfere in Rick's mind again, which in turn would free him up to be his usual source of energy for Nightmare, and he'd be once again a part of the rest of humanity, in the sense that Nightmare would once again be able to feed on his energies as he saw fit in terms of his nightmares, and because that's what Nightmare is makes his living on, so to speak. That's what he thrives on. And so basically Nightmare is just cutting a deal with Sleepwalker, saying, hey, if you leave, you go back to your realm, then I promise you that I'll ease up on Rick, and he'll be no more besieged by myself than anyone else is. He'll just be a normal fish in a normal pond, more or less. And Sleepwalker at this point, because of the stress in his own life, I mean, he's been eager to return to the mindscape, but he's like, okay, how do I know that you'll keep your word? Because we all know that we as in the Sleepwalkers know how manipulative you are. And so Nightmare basically whips up a gizmo that looks like the device that Sleepwalker initially had back in issue 1, wherein it allowed him to go in between realms, but because it's lost, he's been stuck in Rick's mind as well as the real world. But Nightmare fashions this gizmo for him, and basically it's got a specific use in the sense that Sleepwalker is going to be able to monitor Rick's mental patterns. And so basically, he'll be able to see that Nightmare would keep his word in terms of, not going to any sort of extra length to attack Rick. And like he said, Rick would just be an ordinary, I guess you could say, source of energy for him, like all the other people of humanity. And so at this point, Sleepwalker seemingly takes the bait, and he takes the device with him. And Nightmare even specifies that it's made to exist in both my realm and in your realm, as in the mindscape. So that way, even though you would no longer be a part of Rick's life, you can keep an eye on him. something that's seemingly generous on Nightmare's part. So Sleepwalker seemingly takes the bait, heads towards the entrance within the mindscape, and sure enough, he's looking around and he's seeing from a distance fellow members of his race. And so it's a very interesting visual moment, because you see they look similar, but there's different body types and what have you. And so I thought that was really interesting, visually speaking. But anyway, Sleepwalker seemingly goes into the tunnel, and Nightmare's watching from afar on a sort of makeshift throne of his, and he's looking at a sort of device that he's got to sort of monitor things, as far as the device that he gave Sleepwalker, because it in turn allows him to monitor Sleepwalker's activity, whether he's still in the realm of Nightmare or in the realm of the mindscape. And once he sees that Sleepwalker has seemingly gone into the mindscape, that's when he sort of reacts in triumph, because it turns out that his whole plan was to get Sleepwalker to, yes, go into the mindscape and go home, but basically hit him with the horror of the fact that now that he has a way of keeping an eye on Rick's mental patterns, he can watch as Nightmare fully envelops Rick's mind and just destroys him, basically committing mind rape. And so basically it's a point where much like Nightmare's schemes with Doctor Strange in the past, he's basically trying to step outside of his realm and get a little extra mileage out of someone else's misery. And so around that point, that's when Sleepwalker comes back into Nightmare's realm and is able to basically put him at a point where he has to negotiate. And Nightmare says, you had a chance, you could have gone home. That part I was telling the truth on. But Sleepwalker is telling him that hey, you were too eager to help, and I remembered how my race views you with distrust. And so I was right on the edge, but I started thinking, why would you be doing this? You have all sorts of other people to feed on, other people who have situations different from mine, but who are nonetheless touched by I guess you could say the super powered properties of the Marvel universe. Why aren't you doing this for them? Stuff like that. I'm not quoting verbatim, but it's just Sleepwalker's mind was trying to figure out, why would an entity like Nightmare be trying to do something like this for me? And so what he did was he basically took the device that Nightmare had, threw it into his realm, so that when Nightmare was watching on his throne from afar, it would look like that Sleepwalker had in fact gone into the mindscape, when in fact it was just the device they had given to Sleepwalker that had gone into the mindscape. And so that would actually leave Sleepwalker free to go back into the realm of Nightmare and get him into a point where he'd have to negotiate. And so Nightmare actually is talked into backing off, also forced into backing off, because once again Sleepwalker is basically going in full-on power mode here, and Nightmare realizes that he can actually do some damage to him. So he basically it's like, all right, you want him, he's yours, as in you want Rick, he's yours. And he's like, but just know this, you had a clear shot at going home, and you've thrown it away forever. And, basically Sleepwalker just says, hey, I'd give all that up if it meant, Rick Sheridan gets one good night's of sleep, free from your influence. And so, you get, that's more or less how the story ends, but what with Rick actually, sleeping peacefully for a change. And so I really like this issue. Like I say, it was a very good standalone issue, but it also sort of continued the trend of the darkness kind of creeping into the series, in a sense that Rick was literally attacked by the personification of nightmares themselves, aka Nightmare in person. And you also had both of them going through their own mutual stresses and giving voice to them, and you see, how it's affecting them. But of course, with Rick, I mean, you have, the nightmares. They're just straight up horrifying. I mean, especially with, Joe Quesada's artwork. But also you had Sleepwalker himself, I mean, being, sorely tempted, to, with a genuine way to go home. Like, he's literally right on the edge of going back into, where he belongs. And I mean, that wasn't a trick. Like it was a trick, but it was a real way home. Like, when he was looking through, when he was on the edge, you literally see what he sees. Like, he sees real members of his own race from a distance. Like, he could have gone in, but because, this is a point where Sleepwalker, I mean, he's definitely struggling, but you see, just what heroic, willpower and resolve he has. I mean, you've glimpsed that in earlier issues. Case in point, the bit where, back in issue 11, when he and Ghost Rider mix it up, Sleepwalker, is basically, having to explain to Ghost Rider that if, he takes vengeance on the villains in that issue, that would result in Rick Sheridan being killed, and as a result, it would result in him being killed as well. But most importantly, Rick Sheridan would be either killed or irreparably damaged in terms of his mind. And so basically, Sleepwalker has kind of a history of putting his own ultimate, goals and desires on hold if it means that Rick's going to be endangered. And you see just, basically how heroic Sleepwalker's resolve ultimately is. I mean, it's not without struggle, it's not without problems or temptations. Like, he is prone to temptation, or at least considering it, but which is a very human trait, ironically. But I mean, it's a very relatable trait nonetheless. So the fact that Sleepwalker was able to resist it and power through it and get Rick out of the situation he was in, I mean, it's definitely something that, especially if you're a fan of the series, at least in my opinion, it's definitely one of Sleepwalker's, more triumphant moments, in the sense that, in some ways, it's a battle that only he's going to know about, unless he chooses to talk to Rick Sheridan about it. But it's something that only himself and Nightmare will know about. Like, no songs will be sang of him, of how brave he was, or, the price he paid in order to make sure that, quote unquote, Rick got a good night's sleep, And so, this was a really cool issue. And also you see just how manipulative and evil Nightmare really is. Now, Nightmare as a character tends to be antagonistic, but he also tends to be lawfully evil for the most part, at least in some of the depictions that I've seen him in. But at the same time, considering that he is an antagonistic entity, I mean, he also keeps other people in the Marvel Universe busy, so he kind of goes back and forth here. But here, though, he's in full-on manipulative mode. Like, he always has an agenda, kind of like Mephisto. But at the same time, it's like, I like the fact that there was that bit where, both of them, were having to, read the fine print of their own bargain, as it were, both Sleepwalker and Nightmare, because on one hand, Nightmare had a bit about, it was kind of the equivalent of, you should have read the fine print, buddy. But on the other hand, Sleepwalker's like, I did read the fine print, punk. So that's why he was able to come back in and, get Rick out of the situation he was in. And I also liked how you see Rick's life taking some damage from all that's going on. Like that aforementioned bit where he's falling, he has that sort of waking dream where Sleepwalker comes through the pain. I mean, it's a very awesome and spooky visual moment, but it also shows you just how much the stress is getting to Rick, which in prior issues, I mean, the creative teams of primarily Bob Budiansky and Brett Blevins had done a good job of that. But at the same time, I think Joe Quesada's art, mainly because this was a point where, he was just starting out and, he was very vital and full of energy, and that kind of carried over into his artwork, I mean, it really took on like a whole nother level in terms of, the horror aspect of the book. But yeah, also I really appreciate how this is kind of like a snapshot in time in a lot of ways. I mean, especially if you're, say, a regular, Marvel Comics reader. Yeah, if you're more familiar with Joe Quesada as an editor, I mean, it may surprise you to know in some ways that he actually started off as an artist. And this was, if I remember correctly, it was, I'm not going to say it's his first work, but it was one of his first works, I believe. But yeah, he, amongst other things, for a brief amount of time, he worked on a series called X Factor in the 90s. And he also did what I think is some of his best work in one of my absolute favorite pieces of comic book art and storytelling for DC Comics, which was Batman: Sword of Azrael, in which the character John Paul Valley was introduced to the Batman mythos and the world at large. And the artwork that he turned out for that series was just beautiful. And if I remember correctly, I want to say it was inked by Kevin Nolan. I think. I could be wrong about that. But it was written by Dennis O'Neil. So it was a 4-issue miniseries. Beautiful artwork. In my opinion, it was a career best. But before he did that, though, he was doing work on Marvel Comics. And so he had the short stint on X Factor. Then he had some guest shots here and there on other books. Case in point, Sleepwalker. And so I just think it was really fascinating seeing how an artist kind of starts out in some areas, but I know this wasn't his very first work, but it was one of his first works, I believe. So that was pretty cool. And also I think it was neat that Bob Budiansky was able to bring in a big gun enemy like Nightmare as a guest villain in this series, and yet at the same time write him in character like he would be depicted in, say, the Doctor Strange series. And that definitely shows that Bob Budiansky had some familiarity with the Marvel Universe at large, which really shouldn't come as a surprise because, I mean, he's also, he had also worked on the Ghost Rider series with Johnny Blaze. If I remember correctly, I know he did artwork, but I don't think he did any of the writing, but he definitely did the artwork. But at the same time, something like that would definitely give him some familiarity with, the supernatural side of the Marvel Universe. And so, I guess that kind of comes into play with, his handling of Nightmare. But, yeah, so all around, this was a good issue. I'm going to go ahead and give Sleepwalker 12, Dark Dreams and Darker Schemes, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good issue. And so as a bonus, if it's cool with y'all, I was just wanted to show y'all some standout, or at the very least what I consider to be some standout panels of art by Joe Quesada and Mike Bair and Jimmy Palmiotti. And real quick, I should say that this is also an instance where the inking by both Michael Bair and Jimmy Palmiotti really works well with the pencils, and does what good inks should do. Not cover up the pencils, but they should expound on the pencils. And so, 'cause sometimes what would happen is, I mean, you would have artists who would come in, do pencil work, but maybe they honestly weren't that good at artists, and so the inkers would have to come in and save the day, and so you have these really cool looking pictures, but you didn't realize that behind the scenes it was actually the inkers who were carrying the weight. But here, though, you could tell just by looking at it, it was a two-way street between the pencils and the inks. And so anyway, but yeah, let's go ahead and just look at some of the artwork here. So yeah, This was a fun one. Ooh. Oh, hey, check this out. Game Genie. This takes me way back, because I remember I used to see advertisements for this stuff, when I was a kid. But yeah. Ooh, and Terminator 2 Game Boy. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, this is just the first page, mind you, but a very good detail. Even in the more mundane moments, such as Rick just going to the bathroom or turning lights on and what have you. Very good use of shadow, and I think this is definitely an instance where the coloring really comes into play here. Oh, and here's the bit where Rick has a sort of waking dream right here. So he starts off painting, trying to paint, and you see the paint coming down there. He's starting to nod off. Then things get funky. And see the Sleepwalker's legs gradually coming down. And poof. Sleepwalker is dressing up as Moon Knight for Halloween. There you go. Really cool visual moment for sure. Okay, so remember that bit I was talking about with Rambo, Rick's dog, within Rick's nightmare? Okay, so here he is, he's walking the dog in real life, and then he sits up against a tree, nods off, and then that's when the nightmare kicks in. Sleepwalker comes out, Rambo growls at him, Sleepwalker gets indignant, and you hear this, poor dog, crying out in pain. And there's where we get the whole John Carpenter vibe, John Carpenter's The Thing vibes. You see right there? Yeah, poor guy. But yeah, Sleepwalker basically in this nightmare, he just cuts loose and just starts, killing people left and right. And then Alyssa comes back onto the scene, except in this case it's just a dream. But, she and Sleepwalker were kind of, I'm not going to say they were friends, but she was like one of the few people who actually, tried to give Sleepwalker a benefit of the doubt in real life. And so the fact that she's, approaching him with a certain sense of trust, it shouldn't be surprising. But this being a nightmare, well, it doesn't turn out well for her. And then Rick wakes up. But, some really cool visual stuff. And, oh, cool. Hey, Captain Bucky O'Hare and the Toad Wars. Remember that cartoon? Fun stuff. There you go. And some good, once more you got a good use of, coloring and shading as well. So, Rick falls asleep and he's starting to, cross over into the realm of nightmare. Here, not scary at all. But this is where Sleepwalker's going out of his way to actually go into Rick's mind while he's asleep. And you get this beautiful shot of Sleepwalker and Nightmare meeting face to face. Told you I'd get to Nightmare and show him to y'all in a little bit. But yeah, beautiful picture, beautiful single panel, single full splash page by Joe Quesada and Mike Bair and Jimmy Palmiotti. Beautiful stuff here. Easily one of the coolest pictures of Nightmare. And here Sleepwalker is, the star of his own book, being dwarfed. But you look at the steps here. And just how, everything is just sort of floating in place. You could tell that, the art team did their homework when it came to, seeing how Nightmare had been depicted in books like Doctor Strange, because this is how, this was artist Steve Ditko's, bread and butter. I mean, the way he drew people was very, but the way he drew like the paranormal and just the dreamscapes and things like that, or magic, anything magic related, or just paranormal related, he was a master at. And he would draw stuff like this on a regular basis in the Doctor Strange series. And so, and I know this is Joe Quesada on the art here, but you could tell that, they paid their dues in terms of, researching how Steve Ditko did stuff. And so they took inspiration from it that definitely made it their own. So, beautiful picture once more. But there you go. After their pleasantries are exchanged, it kind of goes back and forth here. Told you the cover art was very true to what was happening in the book. But yeah, probably one of the few times that Nightmare realized that he's, bit off more than he can chew. And yet he still holds all the cards. I kind of like this panel right here. I mean, because even though this is just, Nightmare showing Sleepwalker, other members of his race and just how he sees them, you see Sleepwalker in different body types, or I should say, the different body types of the Sleepwalker race. And that kind of comes into play here. Oh, I also like this little picture of Nightmare explaining, his purpose and everything, but also this little series of panels where you see him going down the staircase, and you see, this little gremlin, eventually just get kicked off the steps by Nightmare. And there's a little, device that Nightmare sort of fashions up for Sleepwalker. But I like this shot right here. It's like, there's Rick, trying to, have a peaceful sleep, and there's these two dream entities, or mind entities, sort of just, arguing over his well-being, Sleepwalker and Nightmare. That's a good shot of both of them right there. Okay, and here's the little shot I told you about earlier where Sleepwalker's on the edge, but he's looking into his realm and he's actually seeing other members of his race. But see right there. That's a cool little shot there. So yeah, he's like right on the edge, right on the edge. There's Nightmare on his makeshift throne. Yeah, I love that picture, where his true colors are revealed. And of course, Sleepwalker comes in and saves the day. There you go. Rick gets a full night's sleep at last. I'll just go ahead and read this real quick. I would gladly trade all my hopes in exchange for Rick's getting a good night's sleep, for I am a sleepwalker, and for me, there is no rest. So, that's kind of his character in a nutshell. But yeah, that was Sleepwalker 12. I hope y'all enjoyed it. I hope y'all enjoyed my review of it, and I hope you enjoyed, seeing the really cool artwork that was on hand here, and a little flashback to the 90s, of course. But yeah, thanks for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments, please drop a line below, or if you want to give me some feedback, I'd love to hear it. And if you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.